The static crackled through the operations center like electricity before a storm. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb pressed his headset tighter against his ear, straining to catch fragments of the transmission bleeding through the interference. 3 hours ago, SEAL Team Bravo had gone dark somewhere in the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan, their last known position, a grid coordinate that might as well have been the surface of Mars for all the good it did them now. Still nothing, sir, Petty Officer Rodriguez reported from his bank of communication equipment, his voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that comes from watching good men disappear into the electronic void. The jamming was sophisticated, military-grade, designed to turn modern warriors back into isolated islands of flesh and fear in hostile territory. Webb stared at the tactical display, where 8 green dots had been frozen in time since 3:47 hours. 8 of America's finest, led by Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison, a man who'd pulled more operators out of impossible situations than anyone had a right to. Now Morrison and his team were ghosts in the digital landscape, their fate unknown, their voices silenced by an enemy that understood the modern battlefield better than anyone had anticipated. The mission had been textbook: infiltrate, eliminate a high-value target suspected of coordinating attacks on coalition forces, and extract. Clean, surgical, routine for operators of their caliber. The Taliban compound sat in a valley carved between peaks that scraped the belly of heaven itself, accessible only through a narrow approach that any competent force would monitor. But SEAL Team Bravo wasn't just competent, they were legendary. Yet something had gone catastrophically wrong. The jamming signature was unlike anything intelligence had briefed. It pulsed with mathematical precision, creating dead zones in the electromagnetic spectrum that seemed to anticipate and counter every frequency the SEALs might use. Whoever was behind this understood American communications doctrine intimately, had studied it, prepared for it, turned it into a weapon against those who depended on it most. Webb's fingers drummed against the metal table, a nervous rhythm that betrayed his growing desperation. Standard protocol demanded they wait 6 hours before considering the team compromised, but 6 hours might as well be 6 years when men were bleeding out in the mountains. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a presence, heavy and malevolent, pressing against the operations center like something alive. In the corner of the room, Captain Elena Vasquez sat quietly at her workstation, monitoring aviation frequencies with the kind of focused intensity that comes from years of translating chaos into clarity. Most of the staff barely noticed her anymore, the former Air Force pilot relegated to routine support duties after an incident that everyone knew about but nobody discussed. Some called her washed up, others whispered she'd lost her nerve. But Webb had seen her personnel file, had read between the classified lines, and knew that appearances could be deadly deceptive. The mountain range stretched across northeastern Afghanistan like the spine of some prehistoric beast, its peaks jutting into thin air where oxygen became a luxury and helicopter rotors struggled to find purchase. Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison pressed his back against the cold stone of an outcropping, feeling the weight of 7 men's lives settling on his shoulders like snow that refused to melt. The ambush had come from 3 directions simultaneously, coordinated with the kind of precision that spoke of extensive reconnaissance and intimate knowledge of SEAL tactics. Morrison's radio crackled with nothing but hostile static, the jamming so complete it might as well have been solid walls built around their position. His team was scattered across the valley floor below, taking cover behind whatever the harsh landscape provided: twisted metal from a Soviet-era tank, ancient stone walls that had witnessed decades of warfare, shallow depressions in earth that had been churned by countless conflicts. "Chief, we got movement on the East Ridge," whispered Petty Officer First Class Tommy Kowalski, his voice barely audible over the wind that howled through the valley like the breath of ghosts. Through his scope, Morrison could see muzzle flashes winking like malevolent stars against the mountainside. The enemy had patience, discipline, and most importantly, the high ground. The original plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Fast rope from two Black Hawks under cover of darkness, neutralize the target, and extract before dawn, painted the mountains in colors that would make them visible to every hostile eye for miles. But the helicopters had been forced to abort their approach when surface-to-air missiles lit up the night sky like deadly fireworks, and the team had been forced to insert on foot through terrain that seemed designed to break both equipment and spirits. Now they were pinned down in a killing field, their sophisticated communication equipment rendered useless by jamming technology that shouldn't have existed in this remote corner of the world. Morrison had fought in Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and a dozen other places that officially didn't exist on any mission reports, but he'd never encountered electronic warfare capabilities this advanced in the hands of irregulars. The Taliban fighters positioned around the valley weren't the usual collection of farmers and religious zealots armed with Soviet-era weapons and religious fervor. These men moved with tactical precision, used hand signals that spoke of professional military training, and most disturbing of all, seemed to anticipate American responses before they were made. Morrison's M4 carbine felt warm in his hands despite the freezing mountain air, the familiar weight providing psychological comfort that his rational mind knew was largely illusory. Ammunition was finite, extraction uncertain, and every minute that passed without communication increased the likelihood that this valley would become their tomb. Through his night vision goggles, the landscape took on the green-tinted surreal quality of electronic dreams, but no amount of technology could change the fundamental mathematics of their situation. 8 Americans against an unknown number of hostiles who controlled every piece of advantageous terrain, possessed superior intelligence about SEAL capabilities, and had demonstrated both the patience and resources necessary to plan this trap with methodical precision. Back at Bagram Airfield, Captain Elena Vasquez adjusted the frequency on her radio with movements so subtle they seemed unconscious, her fingers dancing across controls worn smooth by countless hours of use. The operations center buzzed with the controlled chaos of a military unit facing a crisis that had no clear solution, but she remained an island of calm in the electronic storm. Still no contact with Bravo team, Rodriguez reported for the 100th time, his voice carrying the strain of a man watching helplessness multiply with each passing minute. The standard communication protocols had failed completely, reduced to meaningless ritual in the face of jamming technology that seemed to evolve and adapt in real time. Webb paced behind the communication stations like a caged predator, his usually immaculate uniform showing signs of stress in the form of wrinkled fabric and loosened collar. Command had made their position clear. SEAL Team Bravo was expendable if their loss prevented a larger tactical disaster, but that kind of cold strategic calculus offered little comfort when real men with real families were bleeding in the mountains. "What about satellite imagery?" Webb asked, though he already knew the answer. The valley where Bravo team had gone dark sat in a natural dead zone, surrounded by peaks that created shadows where even the most sophisticated reconnaissance satellites struggled to penetrate. "Negative, sir. Weather's moving in, and we're getting maybe 30% visibility even on infrared." The intelligence officer's voice carried the frustration of a man whose tools were proving inadequate to the task at hand. Captain Vasquez had been monitoring aviation frequencies for 3 years, ever since her transfer from active flight status to what the Air Force euphemistically called administrative duties. Most of her colleagues assumed she was marking time until retirement, a former pilot whose nerve had been broken by an incident that remained classified but had effectively ended her career in cockpits. They were wrong about her nerve, but they weren't entirely wrong about her career. The incident in question involved a training exercise over Nevada that had gone catastrophically wrong when atmospheric conditions created a phenomenon that meteorologists called atmospheric ducting, a temperature inversion that could bend radio waves in impossible directions, creating communication corridors through the electromagnetic spectrum that defied conventional understanding. While other pilots had struggled with equipment failure and communication blackouts, Vasquez had recognized the phenomenon, adapted to it, and used her understanding of atmospheric physics to maintain contact with air traffic control. Her innovation had saved lives and prevented a larger disaster, but it had also raised questions about her methods that made her superiors uncomfortable. Now, listening to the static that imprisoned SEAL Team Bravo, she recognized patterns that others missed, atmospheric signatures that spoke of specific weather conditions, and electromagnetic anomalies. Her fingers moved across her radio controls with the precision of a pianist interpreting a complex score, searching for frequencies that might exist in the spaces between conventional understanding. The mountains of Afghanistan were more than geographical features. They were atmospheric laboratories where physics behaved according to rules that textbooks couldn't fully explain. The wind howled through the valley with increasing intensity, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of weather that would make their already desperate situation exponentially worse. Chief Morrison pressed his eye to his rifle scope, searching for targets among shadows that seemed to shift and move with malevolent intelligence. The enemy had settled into positions that maximized their advantages while minimizing exposure to return fire, displaying tactical sophistication that spoke of extensive training and careful preparation. "Chief, we're running low on ammo," Kowalski's voice carried across the rocky terrain, barely audible above the wind that seemed determined to strip away every word before it could reach its intended recipient. The observation was accurate but unnecessary. Morrison could count rounds remaining by the sound of his men's weapons, could measure their desperation in the intervals between shots fired. The Taliban fighters had demonstrated remarkable patience, content to maintain their positions, while the Americans exhausted their ammunition against stone and shadow. It was a strategy that revealed both professional competence and intimate knowledge of how SEAL teams operated under pressure. Most irregular forces would have pressed their advantage through direct assault, but these men understood that time was their most effective weapon. Morrison's radio continued to emit nothing but hostile static, the jamming so complete that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing against his eardrums like water at the bottom of the ocean. He'd fought in enough classified operations to understand electronic warfare, but this was something different, more sophisticated, more targeted, more personally malevolent than anything he'd encountered in 2 decades of special operations. Through his night vision, the mountains took on an alien quality, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds that seemed to swallow light itself. The landscape was beautiful in the way that deadly things often are, combining majesty with the promise of violent death for those who underestimated its power. The original intelligence briefing had described their target as a mid-level coordinator, someone important enough to justify the mission, but not significant enough to warrant the kind of sophisticated defenses they'd encountered. Either the intelligence had been catastrophically wrong, or they'd walked into something much larger than anyone had anticipated. Morrison made hand signals to his scattered team, coordinating fields of fire and movement patterns using techniques that hadn't changed significantly since World War II. Technology had failed them, reducing America's most sophisticated warriors to the same basic tactical problems that soldiers had faced for centuries: move, shoot, communicate, survive. The irony wasn't lost on him that, in an age of satellite communication and precision-guided weapons, his team's survival might depend on skills that his grandfather would have recognized from the beaches of Normandy. The mountains cared nothing for technological advancement, and bullets still killed regardless of how sophisticated the weapons that fired them. In the distance, Morrison could hear engines, vehicles moving along mountain roads that shouldn't have existed on any map, reinforcements arriving for an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources and supernatural knowledge of American capabilities. Captain Elena Vasquez closed her eyes and listened to the static, with the concentration of a musician detecting subtle changes in a complex symphony. The interference pattern wasn't random. It pulsed with mathematical precision, creating dead zones that shifted and moved like living things through the electromagnetic spectrum. But within that hostile environment, she could detect something else: atmospheric anomalies created by the unique geography of the Hindu Kush Mountains. The phenomenon she'd encountered over Nevada 3 years ago was present here as well, though magnified and distorted by terrain that created acoustic shadows and electromagnetic corridors that existed outside conventional understanding. Temperature inversions in the thin mountain air were bending radio waves in directions that defied standard propagation models, creating communication pathways that couldn't be detected by conventional equipment. She opened her eyes and began adjusting her radio configuration, making modifications that would have seemed random to anyone who hadn't spent years studying the intersection between atmospheric physics and electronic communication. Her fingers moved with surgical precision, fine-tuning frequency settings and power outputs to exploit conditions that existed for only brief moments in the ever-changing atmospheric environment above the mountains. The operations center continued its controlled chaos around her. Officers and enlisted personnel focused on conventional solutions to an unconventional problem. But Vasquez understood that sometimes the most sophisticated technology could be defeated by atmospheric conditions that occurred naturally, and that those same conditions could be exploited by someone who understood their behavior. Her radio crackled, and for just a moment she heard something that wasn't static: a human voice, distorted and fragmented, but unmistakably American. The signal lasted less than 2 seconds before disappearing back into the electronic storm, but it was enough to confirm her theory. Webb noticed her sudden change in posture, the subtle shift from passive monitoring to active engagement. "Captain, you got something?" "Maybe, sir. I'm detecting atmospheric conditions that might allow limited communication, but the window would be extremely narrow." Her voice was calm, professional, betraying none of the excitement that came from the possibility of turning theory into life-saving reality. "Explain it to me like I'm 5 years old," Webb said, moving closer to her workstation. The operations center had grown quiet, all attention focused on the woman who'd been relegated to routine duties but might hold the key to saving 8 American lives. Vasquez pulled up a weather display that showed atmospheric pressure readings and temperature gradients across the mountain range. The mountains are creating temperature inversions that bend radio waves beyond their normal propagation patterns. Under specific conditions, signals can travel through atmospheric corridors that don't exist on paper but are physically real. "Can you reach them?" "I don't know yet, sir, but I'm going to try." The enemy fire had intensified, muzzle flashes creating a deadly constellation across the valley walls as Taliban fighters pressed their advantage against Americans who were running low on ammunition and hope in equal measure. Chief Morrison could feel the tactical situation deteriorating with mathematical precision, each shot fired by his team reducing their defensive capabilities, while the hostile forces seemed to possess unlimited resources. "Chief, I got movement on the South Ridge," Petty Officer Martinez reported, his voice tight with the controlled fear that comes from recognizing that death is no longer theoretical but a rapidly approaching reality. Through his scope, Morrison could see figures moving with tactical precision, flanking maneuvers designed to eliminate the Americans' remaining defensive positions. The wind had picked up, carrying snow and the promise of weather that would ground any potential rescue aircraft for hours or possibly days. Mountain weather was notoriously unpredictable, capable of transforming from clear skies to whiteout conditions in minutes, and the forecast called for a storm system that would make helicopter operations impossible. Morrison's radio crackled, and for just a moment he thought he heard something that wasn't static, a fragment of human voice, so brief and distorted that it might have been imagination born of desperation. but the sound was enough to make him press the device against his ear with renewed intensity, straining to catch any signal that might connect them to the outside world. "Anyone else hear that?" he whispered into his throat microphone, knowing that his team's short-range communications were still functional even if their long-range capabilities had been neutralized. "Negative, Chief," came the response from multiple team members, but Morrison was certain he'd heard something. The static pattern had changed, becoming less uniform, less mathematically perfect in its hostility. The Taliban fighters had begun using coordinated fire and movement tactics that spoke of professional military training, advancing by bounds while maintaining covering fire that kept the Americans pinned behind increasingly inadequate cover. Morrison could see the tactical clock running down, could calculate with mathematical precision how much time remained before their ammunition was exhausted and their position became untenable. But something in the radio static had changed, and that change represented the first glimmer of hope they'd had since the mission went sideways. Morrison had learned to trust his instincts over 2 decades of special operations, had survived situations that should have killed him by paying attention to details that others missed. The static wasn't just noise anymore, it was communication, trying to break through barriers that seemed impermeable but might not be insurmountable. Someone, somewhere, was attempting to reach them, fighting the same electronic war that had isolated them in this valley of death and shadow. Morrison keyed his radio and spoke into what seemed like electronic void. "This is Neptune Actual, Neptune Actual. Any station, we are in contact and need immediate assistance." His words disappeared into the static, but for the first time in hours, he felt like they might actually reach another human being. Captain Elena Vasquez fine-tuned her radio settings with the precision of a surgeon, making adjustments measured in fractions of frequencies that existed in the spaces between conventional understanding. The atmospheric conditions were changing as the weather system moved through the mountains, creating brief windows of opportunity that opened and closed like doors in an electronic maze. Her workstation had become the focal point of the operations center, officers and enlisted personnel gathering around her equipment with the kind of desperate hope that comes when conventional solutions have failed completely. But she ignored the attention, focusing instead on patterns in the static that revealed the electromagnetic landscape of the Hindu Kush Mountains. "I'm getting something," she announced, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Fragmentary transmission, American voice, requesting assistance." The words galvanized the operations center, transforming passive despair into active engagement. Webb moved closer, his face reflecting both hope and skepticism. "Can you establish two-way communication?" "I'm trying, sir. The atmospheric conditions are unstable, creating communication windows that last only seconds at a time." Her fingers danced across her controls, making adjustments that seemed to anticipate changes in conditions that hadn't occurred yet. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer. "Neptune Actual to any station. We are pinned down and taking effective fire. Request immediate assistance, over." Morrison's voice, distorted by atmospheric interference but unmistakably human, filled the operations center with the kind of electric energy that comes from snatching hope from the jaws of despair. Rodriguez grabbed his microphone, ready to respond, but Vasquez held up her hand. "Wait, I need to time this perfectly, or the signal won't propagate." She watched her atmospheric displays, waiting for conditions that existed more in theory than in measurable reality. The seconds stretched like hours, each moment of silence increasing the possibility that the communication window would close permanently. But Vasquez had spent 3 years studying atmospheric anomalies, had learned to read the invisible architecture of the sky like a three-dimensional map. "Now," she said, nodding to Rodriguez. "Neptune Actual, this is Bagram Operations Center. We copy your transmission. What is your status? Over. The response came through layers of static and atmospheric distortion, but it was clear enough to understand. Bagram operations, Neptune actual. We are surrounded and low on ammunition. Enemy has sophisticated jamming capability and superior numbers. Request immediate extraction. Over. Webb felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders like armor that was simultaneously protective and crushing. 8 American lives depended on decisions that would be made in the next few minutes, and every option carried risks that could transform a rescue into a larger disaster. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, mountain conditions that made helicopter operations extremely hazardous, even under ideal circumstances. But SEAL Team Bravo was running out of time and ammunition in equal measure, trapped in a valley that seemed designed to kill anyone foolish enough to enter it. "Captain, how long can you maintain this communication?" Webb asked, his mind already calculating the tactical requirements for a rescue operation that would push equipment and personnel to their absolute limits. "I don't know, sir. The atmospheric conditions are constantly changing, and I'm having to adjust the radio configuration in real time just to maintain contact." Vasquez's voice carried the strain of intense concentration, her attention divided between the conversation and the complex array of equipment that made it possible. Webb turned to his operations staff, his voice carrying the authority of command and the urgency of a situation that measured time in heartbeats rather than hours. "I need options for extraction, weather report, available aircraft, and the fastest possible response time." The intelligence officer consulted his displays, his face grim. "Sir, we've got a major weather system moving through the area. Winds are gusting to 40 knots, visibility is dropping rapidly, and the ceiling is coming down fast. Helicopter operations are going to be extremely hazardous." "Define extremely hazardous," Webb demanded, his tone making it clear that he wanted specific assessments rather than general observations. "Sir, we're at the edge of safe operating parameters now, and conditions are deteriorating. In 30 minutes, helicopter flight will be impossible for at least 6 hours, possibly longer." Webb processed the information with the cold calculation that command required. 6 hours was longer than SEAL Team Bravo could survive in their current situation, but launching a rescue operation in weather that could kill both the rescuers and the rescued wasn't a viable alternative. Rodriguez leaned forward over his microphone, waiting for another communication window to open. The static pattern had changed again, becoming more chaotic as the weather system interfered with the atmospheric conditions that made communication possible. "Neptune actual Bagram operations. We are preparing extraction assets. Can you hold position for 30 minutes? Over." Morrison's response came through static so heavy it was barely intelligible. "Negative, Bagram. We are taking accurate fire from multiple positions. Ammunition is critical. We need immediate assistance." Over. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, clear and unambiguous in their implications. SEAL Team Bravo was dying in the mountains, and conventional rescue operations were becoming impossible with each passing minute. But Captain Elena Vasquez was studying her atmospheric displays with the intensity of someone who had found a solution that existed outside conventional understanding. The Taliban fighters had begun their final assault, moving with the coordinated precision of professional soldiers who understood that the Americans were nearly finished. Chief Morrison could hear their voices calling to each other across the valley, tactical communications in Pashto, and what sounded like Russian, confirming his suspicion that this was more than a simple ambush by local irregulars. "Chief, they're coming from 3 directions," Kowalski reported, his voice steady despite the circumstances. The young SEAL had proven himself in firefights across 2 continents, but this situation was beyond anything in their training or experience. Morrison's ammunition count was running dangerously low, each round having to be placed with surgical precision to maximize the defensive value. His team was scattered across a kill zone that offered minimal cover against enemies who seemed to possess unlimited resources and supernatural knowledge of American tactical doctrine. The radio crackled again, and through the static came Vasquez's voice, clearer than before. "Neptune Actual, this is Bagram Operations. I am Captain Elena Vasquez, and I'm going to talk you through something that's going to sound impossible, but I need you to trust me, over." Morrison had never heard of Captain Vasquez, but her voice carried the kind of calm competence that he associated with professionals who performed miracles under pressure. "Copy, Captain. We're listening, over." "Neptune, I need you to understand that the jamming you're experiencing is being enhanced by atmospheric conditions. But those same conditions can work for us if we use them correctly. I'm going to give you frequency settings that will allow direct communication with extraction assets, but the window will be extremely narrow, over." Through his scope, Morrison could see enemy fighters moving closer, their advance coordinated and disciplined in a way that suggested extensive rehearsal. But Vasquez's voice represented the first tactical advantage they'd had since the mission began, and he was willing to try anything that might save his team. "Roger, Captain. Send your instructions, over." Vasquez's voice became crisp and professional, the tone of someone who had done the calculations and was confident in the results. "Neptune, switch to frequency 243.625 MHz, set your power output to maximum, and transmit at exactly 15-second intervals. The atmospheric conditions will create a communication corridor that bypasses the jamming, but timing is critical, over." Morrison made the adjustments to his radio while bullets cracked overhead, the enemy fire intensifying as Taliban fighters pressed their final assault. The frequency setting seemed random, existing in a part of the spectrum that shouldn't have been usable under current conditions. But when he keyed his microphone and spoke into what had been electronic void, his transmission was answered immediately by a voice that carried the distinctive sound signature of aircraft communication. "Neptune Actual, this is Razor 23, inbound to your position with a full load of freedom, over." Chief Morrison felt the tactical situation transform in an instant, despair replaced by the kind of hope that comes from hearing the voice of American air power arriving to settle accounts with those who had made the mistake of threatening his team. But the weather was deteriorating rapidly, and even the most skilled pilots would be challenged by conditions that were approaching the limits of what aircraft could handle. "Razor 23, Neptune Actual. We are surrounded by approximately 30 to 40 hostiles in prepared positions. Danger close fire support requested immediately, over." The pilot's voice came back with the calm professionalism that Morrison associated with close air support specialists who had perfected the art of delivering precision death from above. "Copy, Neptune. I show your position on GPS. Can you mark targets with laser designation, over?" Morrison pulled out his laser designator, a piece of equipment that could paint targets with invisible light that aircraft sensors could detect with lethal precision. But using the device would expose his position to enemy fire, and the weather was creating visibility conditions that made accurate targeting extremely challenging. "Razor 23, be advised we have multiple target areas on ridgelines to our north, east, and south. Weather is deteriorating rapidly, and we are taking accurate fire from concealed positions, over." The pilot's response carried both confidence and concern. "Roger, Neptune. I'm going to make one pass to identify targets, then we'll light them up. Keep your heads down and be ready to mark anything that shoots at us, over." Through the static and wind, Morrison could hear the distinctive sound of jet engines approaching, the whistle of turbines that represented salvation for Americans who had been abandoned in hostile territory. But aircraft were vulnerable to the same surface-to-air missiles that had driven off their extraction helicopters, and the Taliban fighters below had demonstrated sophisticated capabilities that included advanced weapons systems. Captain Elena Vasquez monitored the communication with the focused intensity of someone who understood that her atmospheric calculations were about to be tested under conditions where failure meant death for 8 American warriors. The frequency corridor she'd identified was holding, but barely, buffeted by weather conditions that were making the entire operation marginal at best. Razor 23, this is Bagram Operations. Be advised that atmospheric conditions are creating communication windows that open and close rapidly. Maintain constant contact with ground units and be prepared for signal degradation. Over. The pilot's acknowledgement was professional but tense. Copy, Bagram. We're threading the needle here with weather and terrain, but we're committed to the mission. Over. Webb watched the tactical display with the mixture of hope and dread that comes from launching operations that exist at the absolute edge of what's possible. The A-10 Thunderbolt II came out of the weather like an avenging angel, its twin engines screaming through mountain air that seemed too thin to support anything heavier than prayers and desperation. Captain Sarah Razor McKenna had been flying close air support missions for 8 years, but the combination of weather, terrain, and tactical complexity made this one of the most challenging sorties of her career. Through her heads-up display, she could see the valley where SEAL Team Bravo was pinned down, a geographic bowl surrounded by ridgelines that provided perfect firing positions for enemies who had planned this ambush with meticulous attention to detail. The weather was marginal for flight operations, with visibility dropping and winds that threatened to push her aircraft into mountainsides that rose like walls on either side of her flight path. Neptune Actual, Razor 23. I have visual on your position. I need you to mark targets with your laser designator so I can distinguish between friendlies and hostiles. Over. Morrison's response came through atmospheric interference that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. Razor 23, Neptune. Target ridgeline to our north, multiple muzzle flashes. Approximately grid 41 SMD 12,345, 67,890. Over. McKenna banked her aircraft to the left, feeling the wind try to push her off course as she lined up for a strafing run that would require surgical precision to avoid hitting the Americans below. Her 30 GAU-8 cannon was designed to destroy tanks, but it could also deliver precision fire that would neutralize infantry positions with devastating effectiveness. Neptune Razor 23, I have your laser designation. Guns, guns, guns. The Thunderbolt's cannon spoke with a voice like thunder, sending 30 depleted uranium rounds downrange at 4,200 rounds per minute. The impact on the mountainside was visible even through the deteriorating weather. Explosions of stone and smoke that marked the violent end of Taliban fighting positions that had seemed impregnable moments before. Enemy return fire was immediate and accurate, tracer rounds reaching up toward her aircraft like deadly fireworks. But the Taliban fighters had made a tactical error by revealing their positions, and McKenna had the training and equipment necessary to exploit that mistake. Razor 23, Neptune Actual. Outstanding work. We need fires on the East Ridge now, danger close. Over. McKenna adjusted her attack heading, bringing her aircraft around for another pass while monitoring engine parameters and fuel consumption that would determine how long she could remain in the area. The weather was worsening rapidly, creating turbulence that made precision targeting increasingly difficult. But below her, 8 American warriors were depending on her skills and her willingness to push both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. She had sworn an oath to support ground forces in contact, and that oath didn't include exceptions for bad weather or challenging terrain. Her second strafing run was even more accurate than the first, cannon rounds walking across enemy positions with mathematical precision that turned prepared defensive positions into smoking craters filled with the remains of those who had underestimated American air power. Captain Elena Vasquez maintained her communication links with both the ground team and the aircraft. Her radio configuration adapted to atmospheric conditions that changed from moment to moment. The frequency corridor she discovered was holding, but she could feel it becoming increasingly unstable as the weather system moved through the mountains. All stations, this is Bagram operations. Weather is approaching minimums for flight operations. Extraction assets need to move now if they're going to move at all. Over. Morrison's voice came through the static with newfound confidence. Bagram operations, Neptune actual. Close air support has neutralized primary threats. We are ready for extraction. Over. Webb had been monitoring the tactical situation from the operations center, watching green dots on his display that represented American lives moving from desperate defensive positions toward a landing zone that existed more in hope than in reality. The weather was at the absolute edge of safe helicopter operations, but SEAL Team Bravo had bought themselves a window of opportunity with courage and precision air power. Neptune actual, this is Phoenix 17, inbound to your position for extraction. Prepare for immediate departure. Over. The MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter appeared through the weather like a technological miracle, its rotors chopping through mountain air that seemed determined to prevent any rescue operation from succeeding. Chief Warrant Officer 3 Maria Phoenix Santos had been flying special operations missions for 12 years, but the combination of weather, terrain, and tactical situation made this extraction one of the most challenging of her career. The landing zone was barely adequate, a small area of relatively flat ground surrounded by rocks and debris that could destroy helicopter components if encountered during landing or takeoff. But Santos had trained for exactly these conditions, had practiced emergency extractions in terrain that existed specifically to challenge pilot skills and aircraft capabilities. Phoenix 17, Neptune actual. Landing zone is cold. Repeat, landing zone is cold. We are ready for immediate extraction. Over. Santos brought her aircraft into a hover that required constant correction for wind and altitude, her co-pilot monitoring engine parameters while crew chiefs prepared to provide covering fire if the tactical situation deteriorated. The weather was marginal for flight operations, but the alternative was leaving 8 Americans to die in the mountains. Morrison led his team toward the helicopter with the disciplined movement of professionals who understood that extraction operations were among the most dangerous phases of any mission. The Taliban fighters who had survived the airstrikes were still capable of effective fire, and the sound of the helicopter would draw their attention like a magnet. Moving to aircraft, Morrison reported, his voice calm despite the circumstances. His team moved with tactical precision, providing mutual covering fire while crossing open ground that seemed designed to kill anyone foolish enough to expose themselves. Santos held her aircraft in a hover that pushed both pilot skills and mechanical systems to their limits, watching fuel gauges and weather displays that told a story of margins that were disappearing with mathematical precision. But below her, 8 Americans were running toward salvation, and she had sworn an oath to bring them home regardless of personal risk. The extraction took less than 90 seconds, but those 90 seconds encompassed a lifetime of professional competence under pressure that transformed a desperate situation into a successful rescue operation. Morrison's team dove aboard the aircraft with the practiced efficiency of operators who had conducted similar operations under fire, and Santos pulled power to lift them out of the valley before enemy reinforcements could arrive. As the Black Hawk climbed away from the mountains, Morrison keyed his radio for one final transmission. Bagram operations, Neptune actual, 8 souls on board and heading home. Thanks to Captain Vasquez for making the impossible possible. Over. In the operations center, Captain Elena Vasquez allowed herself a small smile as she powered down her radio equipment. The atmospheric phenomenon that had made the rescue possible was already dissipating as weather conditions changed, But for a brief window of time, physics and human courage had combined to save 8 American lives. Webb approached her workstation with the expression of someone who had witnessed something that existed outside conventional understanding, but had produced results that couldn't be argued with. "Captain, that was exceptional work. I'm recommending you for commendation." Vasquez nodded professionally, but her attention was already shifting to the next mission, the next problem that might require solutions that existed in the spaces between standard operating procedures and pure innovation. She had spent 3 years in administrative duties, relegated to routine tasks by superiors who had decided that her methods were too unconventional for operational flying. But tonight had proven that sometimes the most sophisticated problems required solutions that combined advanced understanding with the willingness to operate outside established parameters. The SEAL team was safe, the aircraft had returned to base, and the mission that had seemed impossible 6 hours ago was now filed in the successful operations category. Rodriguez looked up from his communication equipment with the expression of someone who had watched a master class in problem-solving under pressure. "Ma'am, how did you know that frequency would work?" Vasquez considered the question carefully before answering, knowing that her explanation would either enhance her reputation or confirm suspicions that her methods were too unconventional for military acceptance. "The mountains create atmospheric conditions that bend radio waves in ways that don't appear in textbooks. If you understand the physics and have the equipment to exploit those conditions, you can create communication corridors that exist outside normal propagation models." Her explanation was accurate but incomplete, leaving out years of